Welcome everybody, and glad that we got about 400 people in climbing, so we got a pretty good number this evening, about a third of total people registered. So that's great. I'm really excited tonight. The last two sessions, as those of you who have logged into all the sessions know, were with two people that I've had, I've been, Eddie Moore Jr., who I've been friends with for a long time and collaborated with, and then Cornelius Minor, who, I've gotten to know over the last few months. And tonight is a little different situation because Curtis and I have never met, but we've known of each other's work, and I've long been an admirer of his and sort of following the exploits in Tucson that I'm sure he'll talk about this evening. And it's one thing to, for me to sit behind a computer screen and write about, social justice pedagogy and equity and justice. It's another thing, while I'm doing that, for, people to be, making themselves vulnerable to do the work on the ground and in real life. And so I just so admire that. And I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about that. So I'm going to introduce Curtis here, and then I am going to turn off myself. That sounds weird. And then he's going to present to you for a while. Then we'll do the normal thing where I'll come back, toss a couple questions his way. And remember to post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, because hard to follow the chat box. And I will pitch as many of those questions as we can. So I'm going to do you want me to do the long version or the short version here?
You do whatever you like. You can just read the first 3 lines if you want.
I'm going to do the long version because, yeah. So Dr. Curtis Acosta was a high school teacher for nearly 20 years in Tucson, where he developed and taught Chicana Latina literature classes for the renowned Mexican-American Studies program in the Tucson Unified School District. So what was the name of that documentary? Precious Knowledge, was that it?
Correct. Yeah, correct.
So if any of you saw that, that was about, Curtis was in the middle of all that. In the middle, on the top, underneath, next to, he was in all different positions related to that. He is an award-winning educator who is named one of the top 10 Latinos to watch in U.S. politics. Ooh, we don't want Fox News getting a hold of that, by the Huffington Post. Curtis was featured in the documentaries Precious Knowledge and Dolores, and his teaching also received profiles on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, CNN, PBS, The New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, amongst many other media outlets. He has been fortunate to have articles published in Voices in Urban Education, the English Journal, Journal of Language and Literacy, Multicultural Perspectives, the Journal of Education and the Journal of Education Controversy. I like that, Journal of Education Controversy. It's kind of neat. As well as chapters in the books Educational Courage, Resisting the Ambush on Public Education. Ooh, that sounds good. Rethinking Sexism, Gender and Sexuality, and Rethinking Ethnic Studies. Dr. Acosta is also the founder of the Acosta Latino Learning Partnership and Acosta Educational Partnerships, educational consultation firms committed to help educators create culturally sustaining and humanizing educational practices in their classrooms, schools, and communities throughout the United States. ALLP and AEP have provided professional development workshops and training for educators throughout the nation. Dr. Acosta received his Bachelor of Arts degrees from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, and later obtained a Master's of Arts degree and PhD in Language, Reading, and Culture from the University of Arizona in Tucson. He is currently an assistant professor in teaching, learning, and sociocultural studies and director of the MED in Secondary Education Alternative Path program at the University of Arizona. So, so wonderful to have you here again. You're kind of one of my heroes, so I'm feeling kind of giddy about having you here and being able to learn from you watch as all these other people learn from you as well. So it's all yours, and I'm going to mute myself and stop my video, and I'll turn back on once you're finished.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Your igualmente, as we say in Spanish, your work means a tremendous amount to me as well as and our program too here at the University of Arizona, where your equity literacy is one of our pillars. So our students are immersed in your work. So I just want to say this is a great honor. So hopefully everyone can hear me and we're ready to go. I'm just going to dive into it and introduce myself. Good evening, buenas tardes, kwali yowali. My name is Curtis Acosta. I am the son of Samuel Acosta and Sandra Hoffer Whelan, the grandson of Silas and Martha Hoffer, and Margarita and Salvador Acosta. I'm also father of Olin and Santiago Acosta, and the life partner of Patricia Santa Maria Acosta. And so I'd like to say before we move on any further, Tlazo Kamati, thank you, muchas gracias to the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pascua Yaqui Nation for allowing me to be an uninvited guest on their land tonight, and in what is commonly known as Tucson, Arizona. And it's an honor to be with all of you here today. So I thought it would be important to introduce myself in like the traditional way and the old way, because I was watching a little bit of Cornelius when 2 weeks ago, and he talked about our values as educators, how important that is. And so I thought that one of the best ways for me to introduce myself to you all tonight is to be relational with you, and for you to know a little bit about me, my story, and how my values and indigenous epistemologies and have impacted me and connected me to my life, and as well as my actions as an educator. And so I decided that maybe for this evening we talk about that and dive into what I titled Decolonizing Our Classrooms, Living and Teaching Racial Justice, and just focus upon like what that does with our dispositions as human beings, and who are teachers, who have an unbelievable sacred responsibility to guide the youth of our nation and our world. And so before I forget, those are my affiliations. I just want to do a shout out to Education for Liberation Network. If you're not familiar with them, I'm on the board, the advisory board, and maybe some of you know Free Minds, Free People. That is an ed-lib network event that we put on every 2 years. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have it in 21 because of the situation that we're in, but it's just a beautiful space where grassroots folks of color and activists and youth come together and every 2 years and put on a conference that is one of the most one of the places that's the easiest for me to heal and breathe that I've ever met. And now I'm an old head there. This gray is real. And so it was in 2009, the first Free Minds, Free People I ever went to. I was struck, this wasn't there, but I was struck about how much youth were there leading workshops and attending the conference, and it's only grown ever since. So a shout out to all my compañeros and compañeras that are a part of the network. And then there's my university affiliation, which you heard about, a lot less good sentiments for for the neoliberal construction of universities these days than I have for where my heart is as a person of who tends to want to shake up the world in a way that's loving and equity minded. So anyway, that's enough about that. What I'm sharing with you right now is a poem from Luis Valdez, who's one of my heroes. He's a Chicano playwright. He founded El Teatro Campesino. He is a poet. He's a screenwriter. El Teatro Campesino is a very important theater company that came from the movimiento in California during the United Farm Workers struggle in the late 60s and early 70s of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. And so Luis penned these 5 lines to encapsulate his feelings towards the phrase that he had learned that comes from our ancestors, our Mayan ancestors, of En Lakesh. And when En Lakesh, as close as we can translate it in Spanish and English, is that first line from Senor Valdez, which is "Tu eres mi otro yo, you are my other me." So this is what a lot of times I call West Side knowledge, right? Western Hemisphere, right? This is our knowledge of this side of the world, and in Lakesh is that sentiment there of "you are my other self." So we used to read these 5 lines. The class of 2008, in August of 2007, we had read Zoot Suit the year before. I was looping with my students, and they were seniors, and I said, this really symbolizes, I believe, who we are. Like, because at that point, we were learning more about our indigenous epistemologies from our ancestors, and so I asked them if they wanted to read this every day. So you got to be mindful. This was just about 13 years ago. So we're always learning. So a lot of times we think about culture, like you're born into a culture and you get all the cultural knowledge. Well, not when it's wiped out and it's taken from you. But it still survives. And so we were lucky enough to start learning from some of our elders around our community and about these concepts. And so this is always a way for me to call back to my days as a teacher, the beautiful space we had in Tucson, Arizona, and also a way to calm my nerves. So believe it or not, no matter how many times you do this stuff, you get those nice nervous butterflies. So I'm going to read En Lakesh to you. And if we were all in one giant space together, we would read it chorally. One of the things I miss most during this pandemic is to be in space and to be a part of this aspirational and affirmation, this tradition that we had. So I'm going to read it to you, and if you want, that you're all muted, you can read it to yourself. En Lakesh, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo, I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo, I love and respect myself. So this is indigenous knowledge, and what we have that flies in the face of that, right, is where we stand today, which is now the United States of America and its history of colonialism, its history of a white supremacist settler colonial project that has been done on our nation that we're just, I feel, starting to really speak honestly about. So I thought I'd, reawaken some of you that went to school like myself. Maybe you saw this in your U.S. history book back in the day, the John Gast American Progress painting, and to talk about what we see here, right? We see them from lightness to dark, from east to west, and you see the giant figure, this fair-skinned, beautiful, giant, white, flowing robed woman with a star, maybe a star of liberty on her forehead, a star of enlightenment, I don't know. She has technology with her. You see the other technologies coming across. And on the left side of the painting, you see a lot of darkness. You see dark people, our indigenous brothers and sisters, the original stewards of this land, looking up in fear of this figure. You see the animals similarly running from this figure. And you see the domesticated animals under the control of other European American folks. They have different looks on their faces. That bear down there is looking very, very aggressive back at this giant figure. And so for years, that book, I always thought that book must have been the Bible, right? Because Manifest Destiny, this is the idea of, this land was created for Western expansion, meaning European white people were supposed to claim from sea to shining sea, and because it was God's will. So I always assumed that was a Bible because of that connection. And what I want you to look at a little bit closer with me is actually a school book. All right. So the correlation and connection between colonialism, white supremacy, the colonization of this country, the westward expansion of the United States of America is completely, totally, almost redundant with education. And so I think it's really important for us in 2020 to be reflective practitioners and to understand and start to come to grips with that reality of what is education, what was it originally, what was it based on, and what was it inculcating young people to believe. So it's very much a project of the same white settler colonialism. And so when we look at something like this, kill the Indian, save the man was the mantra of boarding schools. And we know of the trauma of boarding schools, and we know of what it did to the families being ripped from their homes. And we also see that this was a project, assimilation project, a violent and traumatic one that happened to children. This is also a part of our history. At one time, this was best practices. That's why when I remember being a faculty member in my high school and always hearing best practices, I always wanted more context, because we've had best practices that are the most dehumanizing practices one could ever imagine. And so we see this as part of our history, part of the 500 years of violence that have been done to people of color, and done by, unfortunately, as you see religious figures and you see the young people dressed in military outfits, by those institutions and by us teachers. And so another call for us to think deeper about who we are. But I also wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about colonialism. And versus imperialism. And you can read that quote by the amazing Linda Smith while I speak. And you can see up there is another picture of Carlisle Indian School in the same project. Because I'd like to talk a little bit about what I've been hearing lately. And it's always a giveaway to hear when we talk about our history, there's this 400 years and 500 years dilemma, and it really shouldn't be a dilemma. So it's been 500 years of colonization, of contact in our country. And then 400 years is super important too, right? Because that was, like, as the 1619 Project has shown us, the encapsulating the anti-Blackness, the anti-Blackness that came with Middle Passage, came with slavery, came with one of the most horrific and traumatic experiences in human history. But when we start the clock at 400 years, we're erasing the history of our indigenous brothers and sisters. And so this is yet another product of colonialism, right? We can't hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. And we don't need to get in the oppression Olympics either, right? We just need to know our history. And that is, for 500 and 400 years, we need to be mindful of both of those traumatic events, and hold those folks and ride for those folks, and understand and really reflect upon what has happened. And because the project continued, right? So you can go throughout our history and look at what happened, 20 years ago to our Arab American population after the events of 9/11. We continued, you can look at the Mexican American experience, the Latinx experience, the Chicanx experience about what's going on historically in the last 200 years. We keep having these. And so what I'm trying to bring to the table today is for us to understand this is all like the stacking up of people, right? Which is colonialism, the stacking up and hierarchy of people, right? Something that really, as I introduced myself as a biracial young person, this really messed me up. Like this idea of like, who's better? And as we come from a system that stacks people, the idea kind of that Paul and Equity Literacy and other folks throughout this country that ride for this type of work, this type of material, social conditions that we need to reconstruct and to transform, is to take this stack and move it this way. That's the work of equity, right? Is like, really, we're all people. And so, but we need to understand in this process of shifting the trauma that's happened and how it's embedded in our structures. So I'm going to keep it moving. In our purposes here in Tucson, the Mexican American Studies Department that I was a part of, as a high school teacher, we were doing the work of typical, more traditional like ethnic studies work, right? Our syllabi was aligned with centered around the Chicanx, Latinx experience. We are doing a comparative to other and broadening the lens to the African-American experience, the Black experience, because there's so much solidarity there. And that's the work I think of ethnic studies, and I hope to return to later. But it was really the transformative moment in the classroom was when we started learning about the Mesoamerican indigenous epistemologies that's found in the Sunstone, what we is the Aztec calendar, what is also in Nahuatl called the Tonomacho. And the Tonomacho, at the center here, you see what we call the Nahui Olin. Nahui in Nahuatl is 4, and Olin is movement. So here are the 4 movements. And for those of us that know about the spirituality and the importance of 4, all up and down Turtle Island, this continent, we know the significance of 4 directions. We know the significance of 4 movements, and so the 4 elements. And so similarly, the idea of 4 was our ancestors kind of giving us a hint about what it means to be a human being. And so what you see is the translations of Tezcatlipoca, Quetzalcoatl, Huitzilopochtli, and Xipe-Totec here in English. And I won't have time to get too deep into this, and I'm going to, a little bit of apology that I have to jam all this in the time that we have. When my team and I do this work, we take a lot more time because this is a lot to handle as we want to grow this lens, this important lens, into our default settings, if you will, as teachers. But I just want to highlight that when I stumbled upon this with my colleagues, we didn't stumble upon it. When our elders shared this with us, it really was a beautiful moment because I knew I did not have a fully humanized classroom. I was missing some of these elements. And I won't get into all those, and maybe they'll come up in the Q&A later, but that became a goal of all of ours in our collective to make it a more human experience for our students. So we had to think about how to operationalize these elements into our pedagogy, into our methodology, and that's what we did. And so I'm just going to quote my brother Sean Arce. Sean's right next to me. He's the big dude, but when we were much younger, just a brilliant scholar. He was our director of Mexican American Studies back in the day. And one of the things is when our program was attacked by the state of Arizona and eventually dismantled in 2012. That's why you see a born on date and a dead date. And the ethnic cleansing happened in January of 2012. Our programs were dismantled, and we can get into that later. But one of the positives about it, there's not many because it was one of the most beautiful spaces I've ever been, especially as an educator, is you get to reflect upon it. And I love this quote from Sean, and it connects to other things I hope to talk with you about during the Q&A. So he's, quote, fundamental to the role of the teacher, what the Nahuatl peoples call temachtiani, is that they possess itli olot, a face, a heart, a concept that Chavez Leva describes as central to Mesoamerican education and philosophy. To develop a strong face and heart was to acquire intellect, morality, and a sense of community responsibility. So this decolonizing process that we had was about humanity. It wasn't about the state standards, and it wasn't teaching just some artificial finish line. It was about, what's interesting is in Spanish, which is of course, a language of the colonizer, but in our cultura, in Spanish, bien educar, right, means something different. Good education means something different in Spanish. It means not your degrees on a wall necessarily, but how you were raised, the quality of, how you treat your elders and the respect you have for other people. And you see a connection here to actually our Mesoamerican roots. And so that was really one of the strongest pulls for all of us, is like, we knew if this was what was being whispered in our ear from the ancestors, if we lived up to this type of standard, that all the other educational standards would come with it. But a lot of discipline and a lot of truth telling has to be done in order to do so. And so what I wanted to do is just focus a little bit right now about, what this all means, and to think about that balance that the Nahui Olin is asking us to do, is to be balanced human beings, or initzi yolot, having a face and a heart, that balance. And we need to move away from like centering of whiteness as far as like how we connect with our youth and center our youth and where they're from and who they are. And so we're moving from centering whiteness toward a solidarity lens, a lens where we really appreciate and learn deeply one another. As teachers, we need to reconcile with our past and the role education has played in white supremacist project of assimilation, you know. And so you see that joyous space there. And so when I think about schooling, I don't think about this, right? To me, this is learning. When I think about schooling, I think about the colonial project that continues to operate, because it's what took our classes out, was white supremacist thoughts and otherizing us and calling us anti-American. And it was just a really painful, hateful time, and a time we stood up to and eventually won in federal court in 2017. But 5 years after we lost our program, we had justice. But this is also where anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity still stick with us, right? So what we're seeing in our country right now is rooted to that same project. And it lives with us in our classrooms and the way, the tensions that we have all over our nation. And so one of the ways that, you know, when I think about schooling, I think about that. I think about that project. I think about coloniality and colonialism and how it puts us at odds with each other. But when I think about learning, I think about joy, love, think about our ancestors, think about youth and humanity. And that's what we can do. And one of the things that really stood out to me with Paul and Cornelius's conversation is, that doesn't mean we do this in a polite way, or that doesn't mean we do this in a benign way. We actually have to do the opposite. We have to have a really strong analysis. So for the rest of tonight, I'm going to focus on the idea of operationalizing this concept of in Lakesh. What does that mean for us, you know, as educators? So to many people, it's a pretty poem. Now, the fact that my students and I read it out loud, I've seen other people do this throughout our country. You know, they've watched our film and they do the same, but then they don't live it, right? You could be in a space where they read this and 5 seconds later, the teacher's yelling at a student and, you know, throwing him outside of the class. And believe it or not, I've actually lived that experience as a guest. So what does it mean when you read these words and when you think about "you are my other me"? You know, sometimes people think of it about the golden rule. And I've done a lot of thinking about in Lakesh versus the golden rule. And one of the things I think about is the golden rules, you know, and forgive me, I'm just going to sum it up, but it's like, do unto others as you've had done unto you. So to me, the more I thought about that verse in Lakesh, that's real reductive. I'm taking the world outside of me and treating it like it's me. Right? So when I look at you, I need to treat you like me. So I'm like transforming you into me. In Lakesh does the opposite. It's expansive, right? You are my other me. So how diverse you are, how different you are from me, it expands me. It makes me more connected to you. It makes me more connected to humanity. It grows who I am as a person, as a human being, rather than have to turn the whole world into something that I can control. It's rather the opposite, something that becomes a mystery that I want to learn about and that I want to learn with. And so Bell Hooks is a hero of mine. And this quote always made me think about the non-example, right? The examples we often have in schools of how it's not working in Lakesh fashion. This when it's not an in Lakesh pedagogy. So I'm gonna read this quote to you real quick. Even though students enter the democratic classroom believing they have the right to free speech, most students are not comfortable exercising this right, especially if it means they must give voice to thoughts, ideas, feelings that go against the grain, that are unpopular. The censoring process is only one way bourgeois values undermine the democratic exchange of ideas. So I just want you to sit with that for a little bit and think about times that when you were a student where you felt like you couldn't voice yourself. You knew going in there, you used your street smarts, you read the room, you listened to the profe, you listened to the teacher, and you're like, this isn't the space for me. And we incubate and cultivate those spaces all the time. Those are the spaces that are not only anti-democratic, they're anti-human. And so they also fit into that colonial framework because whoever has the power, in this case, either the status quo popular stance or the teacher themselves, can bully the conversation and squelch our ability to be free thinkers, critical thinkers, and share our ideas. So I'm going to lean on another scholar right now and hope you can hear her. She's a favorite of mine, my former student, Concepcion, and she's going to give you another analysis building out the non-example and the example of an in Lakesh pedagogy in her breakdown and her analysis of what schooling can be like.
I feel like teachers don't really focus on the familial aspect to make everybody in the classroom more confident to say what they're thinking. And I mean, people, when they're wrong or when their opinion isn't shared or they don't feel popular or anything like that, that they're shy about their opinion and they won't voice it because they feel like they're going to be attacked or they'll be unpopular. Whereas it's different from being in a familial where you feel comfortable around that space and you feel like you're not going to be judged or criticized. Then it's easier to share your opinion even if it's not the popular opinion, because you know that these people aren't going to criticize you and you know it's a safe environment. So even if they don't accept it, not that they won't accept it, even if they don't agree, they will accept it.
That Concepcion drops that even if they don't agree, they accept you. They accept you as a human being, even though our ideas are different. It's continued engagement versus where we find our country right now, right? And to a large extent, other parts of the world too, which is a disengagement from anything that thinks differently to you or your experiences. Again, the insular versus the expansive, right? So she's talking about a familial aspect, you know, like how can we create that safe space as she says it, right? So in Lakesh was our way, our pedagogical way of doing that. And I'm going to get into that a little bit, into more methods, maybe during the Q&A too, about how we created that. But I'm also going to focus on some of the words she used. She used the word attacked. And obviously she used the word safe as the non versus the non-example where you don't feel safe. This is what our youth is telling us all the time, that school doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel safe for LGBTQ kids. It doesn't feel safe for historically marginalized, historically oppressed youth. It doesn't feel safe, you know, with the current rhetoric that's going on in our country and in our hallways and even in our classrooms. So we have to deal with that. We have to build a different type of muscle. And that means many times deconstructing what we've been taught before. So you can read this, but I'm just going to highlight I'm just going to read the highlight, which is the idea that in Lakesh became a guiding principle for us. For not only, it wasn't just a poem, but it was also the way why we should interrogate our world. We should interrogate our world because it is unjust. We should interrogate our world because we are seeing the differences that aren't right and the differences that our youth felt happening in their schooling experience or happening in the rhetoric of the state government as they were attacking our program, or they were attacking their families by outlawing Mexican-American studies, but by also by criminalizing immigration in such a heinous way. And it's an election year, so you've seen all of this. So one of the ways I talk about in Lakesh, like being a pedagogy, is when our students are able to analyze the world and get beyond themselves. So you may be a student of privilege, you may be a student of European American descent, but that doesn't mean in Lakesh doesn't connect with you, right? Because you can see, like, maybe your family can afford to go to Whole Foods, you know, for groceries and get that organic, you know, the fruits and vegetables that are healthy for you. But you know, some of the folks in your community can't, in your school, maybe your best friend, maybe not even your best friend, but you just know because you see your school. And that is what the impetus why we need a community garden. We need a school garden for that. And these are the type of projects that come from grassroots understanding of who we are and who is really in need, and working for the most vulnerable, because that is embedded in the principle of In Lakesh. As I keep moving forward, as you look at those green words, those are the ones that I used in this article. But I really want to talk about In Lakesh being a means towards liberation for our students and a disruption to the systemic hierarchy and power relationships between students and teachers. So one teacher has inauthentic power that's given to them from the state government with a teaching certificate, or from the principal, the superintendent, whomever, can dictate to 30, to 35, to 40 people. And a lot of times, especially with a colonial framework, right, with a controlling framework about power and who has it, that is seen as good. I can tell you that the detractors of our program on the witness stand in 2017 hated the idea of a liberated, co-constructed way of doing school. They thought that was the antithesis of what schooling should be. They're right. That is what the antithesis is, and that's what we need a lot more of, because that is treating each other through an equity lens versus what we have now, which is power can dictate what's going on. And so, so we have these hierarchical relationships at school in our classrooms that we need to start shifting over to that horizontal. And so the last pieces I'm going to focus on when it comes to Enlakesh pedagogy have to do with relationships. And so you can read the quote for yourself. But the idea of authentic and empathetic relationships need to be cultivated. That's almost our first step, is to make sure that we're authentic, empathetic. And I knew, and Cornelius was talking a lot about what empathy meant. So hopefully you listened to that. It was really beautifully put. But what I want to focus upon, since he did that good work, is to talk about it needs to be created and cultivated and sustained through all the relationships in the classroom. So that means me and the whole class is a relationship, because that's a different dynamic, right? But also me and particular students, and also student to student. So many times the cliques come into, the structures, the dehumanizing structures come into our spaces. The left and the right, right? The Democrat and the Republican, whatever these divisive types of things that we place upon our structure, our human existence. We need to break those down and get to know each other in an authentic way, and be disciplined enough to be empathetic, to listen to somebody who may have a different opinion, and to cultivate a sense of togetherness in that space, so that we can be free, like Concepcion was asking us to be, which is for us to maybe disagree about an idea, but not reject somebody's humanity, right? And so one of my favorite folks to go to when it comes to authenticity is the person I believe made it pretty popular in education circles, and that's Dr. Angela Valenzuela. And what Maestra Valenzuela says in her book, Subtractive Schooling, is, quote, a more profound and involved understanding of the socioeconomics, linguistic, sociocultural, structural barriers that obstruct the mobility of Mexican youth needs to inform all caring relationships. Authentic caring cannot exist unless it is imbued with and motivated by such political clarity. And so political clarity can kind of mess people up sometimes, because we're so almost like electric shock buzzer, conditioned as teachers. No, we can't be political, which is insane, right? But really what we can't do is campaign for people. So, but that's not what Angela Valenzuela is talking about. If you don't have political clarity, not a campaign, not a two-party clarity, not that, all that stuff, but a real understanding on the inequities and inequalities and obstructions in our students' lives, then you will be stunted in your ability to foster an Enlakesh classroom. Can't do it. You can't do it. It has to have that clarity. And so going back to the top part of the quote is actually Dr. Valenzuela explaining how we should do this. In essence, we have to have a keen analysis and be ethnographers of our community, and be thinking people that have an analysis about what is going on through socioeconomics, through linguistics, sociocultural, sociopolitical, all these barriers that lead to discriminatory practices, that lead to racism, that lead to hate, that obstruct mobility, and not only of Mexican youth, that's who she was studying at the time, but you know as well as I that we could replace that with African American youth, we could replace that with Arab American youth, Asian American youth, LGBTQ youth. We can use it for women. There's a lot of different marginalized and historically oppressed folks that we need to have that analysis for. So I really appreciate Cornelius talking about that, because I was going to talk about it too, so you get a double dose. So for the last couple minutes, I just want to kind of show you how we deal with this, as far as, or like how we operationalize, as we put this into practice, right? And it's just to be a few minutes, because I'm going to leave the Q&A for more specific questions about this. But this is something that happened in a space that we cultivated with some district partners in Napa years ago. We brought in alumni, young people from Napa Valley College, to sit with some of their former teachers and do kind of an assessment of how things are going at their schools after they've been working with us for a while. And I'll never forget, this is one of the most beautiful moments I've ever been a part of when it came to being in a professional development setting, is when one of the Chicanas said, we're pushing the conversation from creating safe spaces to brave spaces in our schools. And so I want us to like think about that and just go back to what Isa was saying, you know, about, or sort of Concepcion, was saying about safe spaces. And think about like, once you get the baseline of a safe space, you can start getting into those courageous and brave spaces, right? And so we do that in a number of ways. So this is a trajectory that's based upon in Lakesh, based upon humanizing education. That again, when you lose your program and you're banned from your curriculum, you get a chance to think about. So the idea there is we're the silhouettes are the teachers, and we have this lens, but it's also a mirror for ourselves. And then one way to do this is to build out curriculum, build out experiences for our students that can allow students to explore who they are, their identity. Because a lot of times with social justice, we'll skip the whole identity piece and get into the analysis that Dr. Valenzuela was talking about, which is still really important. But we're talking about young people. We're talking about maybe kindergartners. We're talking about teenagers and everybody in between who need to really have some space to figure out who they are, who they're becoming. Because a lot of times what we found in our ethnic studies spaces, in our Mexican-American Raza studies spaces, they've never had that opportunity before. So I was catching them as juniors and they never had a chance to read anything about themselves or to engage in anything that reflected themselves. And so, but once the identity space is created and you again, create it, let them fill it up, right? Then what we'll see is like a voice starts to develop as well from the voiceless. Agency develops from those who have felt that they didn't have agency. And then finally, we get to action and a life fully lived. And that's what our students were when they protested against the closure of our program. They were so fierce and so unbelievable because they were living this experience day to day in a joyous yet rigorous way. And then finally, I just want to emphasize ethnic studies a little bit. Ethnic studies does help us breathe again. And breath is a really important thing, as Eric Garner and George Floyd, those tragedies show us, right? Ethnic studies is the solidarity space that we're talking about. It is the decolonial matter that we can use for us to get to a space to reconstruct together with our youth and our community, something different than the structures we have had to this point that have only divided us more. And so one of the things that we've developed is a teaching model. And if you see down in that bottom left corner, knowledge of development itself, that's where we start. We don't start with curriculum. We don't start with pedagogy. We get there and we bounce around, of course, because we try to stay away from the linear, because there isn't, being linear and as a human being, that doesn't always get along. But the knowledge and development itself is really closely tied to one of those first principles I showed you from the Nahuatl, which is self-reflection. And that's what Cornelius was asking us to do. And that's what Eddie was asking me to do. And that's what I'm asking you to do. And that's what we ask of ourselves, right? Is to be critical practitioners and have to look into that smoking mirror of Tezcatlipoca and figure out where we're at. And also just to remind that there's a reciprocity in ethnic studies that's really important, and that is with the community. So you see community of praxis. So we borrow that Freudian term of critical, reflective action, critical reflective action, if you will, and how there needs to be whatever you're doing in the classroom needs to live outside the classroom space. That is part of our ethnic studies core. And finally, we also developed, I think I went too fast. I'm sorry, y'all. I'll have to go back. There we go. We've developed some tenets that kind of help our teachers, and we align ourselves and ground ourselves with some of this work. And so I'm not going to read all these to you, but it's funny, whenever we talk about how sacred ethnic studies is, I always feel weird because I'm like, school should be sacred. Learning together should be sacred. How come we have to use sacred as a tenet when it should just, math, normal math should be sacred? And I do want to emphasize that ethnic studies is interdisciplinary. So it's not just something you do in a social studies class or even a literature class. It's across the board. It's a lens that we develop. And these tenets help align all sorts of different teachers from K-12, pre-K-12, and beyond about how we can move forward. So we dive into this work with my team and I when we do this with folks. So I'm going to leave you with, I know I'm going to take some questions, but I want to leave you with some questions as well. So after the time together so far, what does in Lakesh mean to you? Like you read that, you think about it. Take some time to think about that for yourselves. Where is in Lakesh thriving in your school and community? Where is in Lakesh absent or under attack in your school and community? So in Lakesh is constantly under threat right now. And we need to figure that out because we're losing far too many people and breaking far too many lives and dreams every day because of the refusal for us to reconcile with some basic truths in our history of our country, and for us not to do the work. We're not putting the work in to critically self-reflect and have an analysis. And so I just leave, there's some contact information. For the first time, this is my big announcement here. I was gonna wait till today. We're gonna go virtual with some of our training. So you can find us on those platforms and reach out to us if you like, but we've worked only exclusively with school districts in the past because of my own trauma. But now our team's robust enough, and I think everyone's got the skills enough to, now with over technology for us to do some really cool work across the internet, right? Using the tools we have in front of us, especially right now during a pandemic, and with the fact that we can't be in the same spaces together, which is obviously my preferred setting. But I leave you there. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Please don't be if I can get there, Paul. Sometimes
actually, before Curtis, before you take this down, can you go back to the previous screen? Sure. For some reason your screen's coming across kind of blurry, so some folks.
I'm sorry. Is it this one or the tenants?
Yeah, the one right before this one.
There you go.
Some people are asking if you'll actually read what the circles say.
Absolutely, as a person who's hard of hearing, because I lost my hearing a couple years ago in my left ear, I understand and would love to help out. So the first one at the top, and then I'll go around. Actually, I'm going to go counterclockwise because that's good for us. Identity. It can be ancestral, communal, intersectional, heterogeneous, and fluid. Sacred is the next one. Social justice, decolonial, and democratic project. Ethnic studies is community and culturally responsive. Ethnic studies works in the hopes of third world solidarity. Ethnic studies is a relationship of power that examines the relationship of power between indigenous people of color and US society. It's intergenerational. Moving over, I wish I could highlight it. Liberatory praxis is socio-political, economic, ecologically and examines our ecological responsibility. And the last bubble, healing and regenerative.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but your slides, your whole screen for some reason comes across kind of blurry. I don't know if there's maybe a way we can share a couple of the slides with people who want to be able to see them, but we can work that out at some later point. Well, thank you. That was great stuff. And I love how I really appreciated you sort of building on Cornelius, some of what Cornelius was saying, and making those connections. Those connections are pretty interesting. I have just one question I want to ask. That's kind of a broad question, and then I'm just going to pull from the Q&A. So I'm going to come back online here. So one of the things I really appreciate, I appreciated all of it, but one of the things from what you established very early was the importance of indigenous knowledges as part of learning and education, and not just content, but also pedagogy and just ways of being. And one thing I think that I could say in general is that in the overall kind of average kind of national discourse around issues of equity and justice, those indigenous knowledges are largely invisible I mean, and there are a lot of other things that are also invisible. And how do you um, how do you make sense of that? Why do you think that is? If you read 500 articles on social justice education, and maybe 5 or 6 of them will mention any sort of even read 100 articles on decolonialism or decolonizing, and even most of those might not even mention indigenous knowledges. Why do you think that is?
You know, I don't know. I think it's because, well, I mean, maybe I do know. Maybe I have an idea. We all kind of, many of us have been, raised and as scholars, as academics, as learners without it. It was already gone by the time, social justice, civil rights movements, especially last century, came to rise. And but I think that's what's really important about, we learned from the late 60s and the folks at San Francisco State that were organizing around ethnic studies, and they were the ones they called it Third World Studies, the Third World Liberation Front. Those youth at the time, right? Our parents and grandparents, they understood that solidarity. They had Native American folks, they had Asian American folks, and Chicanx folks and Latinx folks and African American youth and folks. They understood that, but somehow it always gets in the mess as the message gets out wider. I think we go back to some default settings, and we can't hold those two thoughts in our heads because we've been taught to only hold one thing, to center monoculturally the white, European American experience of America. And somewhere along the line, we've erased that connection point, because a lot of times what happens, I think, is trauma becomes the center of how we look at these movements, unfortunately. And so the trauma of slavery has become the overwhelming narrative about institutional racism, or the roots of our current, our other pandemic, right? Or which is, racism. But I think what happens is, again, we need to connect ourselves to a larger story and know that this is actually a larger project, and it's affected a lot more folks. And that doesn't diminish it should only highlight because through connections, what the African American experience and the Mexican American experience and the Native American experience and all these other experiences can teach us. But unfortunately, when the message gets out to some folks, they just don't have a lens for that. They're too narrow, and ethnic studies would help us. Like if we integrated that into schooling, that idea of solidarity, that idea of teaching each other stories in a much more robust way, I think you're going to get better media. I think you're going to get better leaders. I mean, this is what it looks like when we don't have leaders that have ethnic studies. This is the world, this is the country we get. And I think there can be a better country for us out there.
There are a few people who asked sort of about some of the stuff related to empathy and compassion and sort of building a culture around that. What does that look like? What does compassion look like? It kind of reminds me of James Baldwin's quote, like, I can respect your opinion that's different from my opinion as long as your opinion doesn't erase my humanity. So what does that look like when people's perspectives are erasing other people's humanity? What does compassion, what does compassion look like in that context?
Yeah, we need, that's where we need to be really brave and courageous and hold ourselves and our colleagues and our students or whomever accountable. So that's the one thing when we talk about in Lakesh, it can seem like a softball, but it's really a tough thing for some folks to deal with. So if you have contradictory opinions to an in Lakesh, you are my other me, principle, right? If you have policy desires, in this next election that don't jive within Lakesh, but you're down for it when I read the poem, then it's just an easy question to ask. Like, how does your desires mesh within Lakesh? And so, so the same thing happens like when I used to read that the first day, Paul, and that was my rules. And, they always ask you to like, go over the student responsibilities, that, the handbook. Nah, man, I would read in Lakesh to my students without any context and say, this is my promise to you. I'm going to walk my talk. And this is where, this is how I expect all of us in this space to treat one another. And so when there were violations of in Lakesh, like stepping over, just innocent stuff, like stepping over somebody, talking over somebody, it would be really easy for me to correct, because I'd be like, hey, mijo, you're talking over her, and that, there's a lot of issues right now, gender and inequality and this and that. And how are you practicing in Lakesh right now? And they'd be like, my bad, and that's how easy it could be. When we start thinking about like self-discipline and having real firm principles versus punishment that we often disguise. We say it's discipline out there in our schools, but it's really punishment that we're willing to dole out to our students, not unlike our prison industrial complex. I mean, sometimes our schools and prisons, as my brother David Stovall would say, it's a nexus. It's a prison industrial complex and education nexus, where they collide.
Yeah, that's a great connection. One of the things I'm thinking about with that in Lakesh, that notion is how much help that would be even among the community of people doing sort of critical justice, anti-oppression oriented work, because the amount of, just the lack of compassion and the debates over, well, I have the right word, no, I have the right word, and the sort of viciousness with even people within the activist community can often, treat each other, treat one another. It's, it seems like that could be really useful even among us, the community of people who are trying to do this work.
Absolutely. One of the things I encourage, and this happened when I was talking to different school districts, like right after the 2016 election, and for some reason, people got really, lack of better word, emotionally constipated about being ferocious and calling things the way they are. So like what happens when the president says this, and I'm like, well, if it violates in Lakesh, it violates our principle, it's easy for us to call out. So you got to find principles, that you hold on to. And then if you believe in them as a community, you should be able to call them out. So the same thing for us in the social justice circles is like, if we're really about this life, we should be patient with one another. That's where the call in versus the council culture is much, much more the way I like to go. If I see somebody working hard and they slip up, then it's a call in. That's how my mentors and the people I work with work with me. And I'm fallible. I'm not 100% on it all the time. I'm still learning. I'm still learning at the knees. A lot of really, really amazing people from all the way up to the Pine Ridge and Rosebud and Standing Rock reservations down here to my neighbors here at the Yaqui Res. And I sit and I learn and I listen because they have knowledge that I don't understand. And they correct me sternly and then gently, both depending. But they know my heart. They see it, and they think I'm worth the time. So if we're worth the time, we should also be patient enough to understand that, life is short, but it's also long, And so, there's a Mexica concept, which is also shared, Mexica meaning the Aztecs, but that's what they call themselves, Mexica. That's actually where the word Chicano comes from. But anyway, I digress. That's also shared, this concept of 7 generations is shared with other parts of Turtle Island. It's not just a Mexica concept, which is like we should live in honor of the 7 generations that came before us and for the 7 generations to follow. That should be our setting, our default setting, for lack of a better word, every single day. And so if you have that kind of like calm, that kind of patience, you can be urgent about this work, but also be patient enough to know it's going to take a lot of teaching and a lot of time and a lot of community it's going to take the people. And so we got to put our time in relationally with the people to get us all there. When we start casting people out, we're doing the work of the oppressor for them.
So a couple of people have questions about kind of, well, one thing I really like how you're describing, sort of in the context of a series about teaching anti-racism, is that part of that we often don't talk about is how do you create the context in a learning space to demystify that, to just make it part of the everyday conversation rather than we're going to run a traditional classroom and then we're going to suddenly in January have a conversation about racism. So I think that's really important. But what some people are asking, maybe sort of related to building that context, building that community, or the notion of familia in the classroom is, do you have any thoughts on how to do that virtually and the added challenges that virtual learning might create for that?
Yeah, that's actually something that, that's part of the impetus for us actually to offer stuff online. Because I was like, no, never. Like, we're going to go meet the people, be with the people. But I'm like, dang, there's a lot of need right now. And so that's why we're exploring this for the first time with our own professional development. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the things is, how do we engage with our youth? I'll start with another non-example, unfortunately, Paul. And that is, like, I watch how I ask Santiago's 9 and Olin is 15, and he's a sophomore, and Santi is a fourth grader. And I ask them how much time they get to spend with with their peers. How much time does their teacher ask them, their teachers in Olin's case, how much time do they spend talking about what's going on in their lives, or connecting the content that they're going through with their lives right now, and just connecting with them and how they're doing. And it's rare. It's like, either nil or 20%. If I think about my high schooler, he only mentioned a couple teachers that I've done it at all. So we have to build relations. Like, we're relational people. And that's what I've learned from my Indigenous brothers and sisters. I have a really good friend, Erica Littlewolf. She's always reminding me, like, it's all about being relational. So if that's why we're struggling right now as individuals, but just us connecting is going to fill a little bit of that, you and me, Paul, right, today is going to fill a little bit of that loneliness for me. It's going to inspire me a little bit more. So I'm a little disappointed right now that over the summer, I felt like our educational leaders were being told some mandate, maybe from the federal government. That's my guess about, like, where their funding is going to get jacked from them, because the spring seemed to be more human than the fall has been, right? There's been a lot less talk about what this is doing to our youth and how we manage this moment socially, emotionally, this trauma that we're all going through, the trauma that's going on beyond the green dot that you can see, right? The vision of this you can see. We don't know what is happening in our students' lives unless we ask them, unless we can set up the requirement, the space to do so. And so a lot of what I would suggest is you asking them questions to start revealing little pieces about how they're managing the moment, and that was always one of my default choices that my students had. I would have journal entries up there connecting to their lives in the literature. But I always said, if you're jammed up right now with something, maybe you just broke up in the hallway with the love of your life, or maybe ICE came and visited your home last night, you can't work. There's no way I can ask you to work. But you need to work through that. And what we would try to do is understand, like, be compassionate about, like, work through that, mija, work through that, mijo, because the community needs you to be present. So we might not be able to solve this trauma that just happened to you, or this, this heartbreak that just happened to you today, but you can, like, get yourself in a good space and know you're in a good setting, that you can just exist and work with your community on whatever story we were reading or whatever essay we were writing. And so those are the things that I think that need to become a part of, like, how that lens I was talking about earlier, Paul, like, that has to be just who we are as educators, to know that that's the first thing that we have to do is, like, hey, how are you doing? And if we're not asking, hey, how are you doing to our youth right now, then we have to practice some self-reflection, because we're missing the moment.
I think you just provided the most authentic description of what trauma-informed education ought to look like, not as a way to fix kids so they can score better on tests, but as a way to be student-centered, as a way to be truly mindful of how students are doing. And it's too bad that that's not the way that people are normally thinking about it. It's like, how do we fix you so we can fit you into this traumatizing system instead? I want to get to this. We have time maybe for one or two more questions. And I
Absolutely.
think this is a great question here. So I'm going to read the whole thing to you. It seems like what we need to talk about when we say decolonizing education is a shift in the original purpose of schools, away from service to white supremacist capitalism and toward something new/old. We are working against tremendous power, but as educators, we have a soft and quiet yet significant power. We are in fact funded by the system we are talking about dismantling. So what is the role of educators in creating radical change, and how do we empower one another as educators to do that?
Yeah. Wow. That's beautiful.
Start a
Yeah,
whole discussion based on just based around that question.
It was great writing. I'm celoso, I'm jealous. Yeah, that's why we have to find each other in spaces like this. So, mil gracias, Paul, for creating this space for us, right? Because, and that's why I wanted to emphasize Free Minds, Free People and Education for Liberation Network. Like, you got to find your people, because they're the ones that are going to keep you, they're going to keep you in a loving way accountable, but they're also going to keep inspiring you. And hopefully they'll be the support system for you to be your radical self. So my first crew was our Mexican-American Raza Studies Collective. And I wasn't as strong without them as I was with them. My compañeras and compañeros, my peeps, my friends, they breathed, they made me they grew me, just like we hope we grow, that our youth can grow and blossom, and none of us are beyond it. No matter how much gray hair we have, none of us are beyond growing and blossoming. So I would just say we need to make sure you find those spaces that are pushing your thinking, but and that are dedicated to you, that see your full humanity and see that, the work that you're doing. And if you're early in this work, right, so you don't have like the too many of the examples behind you, then there's room for you too, right? And there's no judgment. That's when you get to ask questions. But you are the company you hold. So you need to find the people that are about liberation, and that should be our goal. Empowerment is a step towards liberation, but the goal is liberation and freedom. And a lot of times, and the scary part for teachers, you're going to be scared when you hear this, is it means once you let go of the control. You let go of the control and you start becoming the guide. And when you can get to that level, and that's the level I'm always trying to balance myself. So I'm not speaking as somebody that's a finished product. I am not. Hopefully people know that from what I've been saying. But letting go of control is a step for us to have humility enough to do this work in a good way.
Awesome, thank you. We're at the end of the time, but I want to squeeze in one last question, because I think this is a compelling question. Is there a strategy you find helpful for helping more conservative people? I know you've had experience with this in Tucson with politicians and everyone. Is there a strategy you find helpful for helping more conservative people connect and bridge to better understand our need for ethnic studies, or the kinds of teaching that you're talking about more generally?
There's a couple of ways. Number one, first is the obvious one, is like, practice in Lakesh. So you have to live that with them, which is also like, a ferocity of holding on to your principles, rather than a ferocity to attack the person that's saying things that is hurtful. So that's a discipline, and it's not easy to do. And that's why having a collective is really important, because you can, like, you know, there's days when I, you know, especially back in the day when we were going through it, that I needed to, like, you know, not today. Today's not the day where I can be up in front and do this in a loving way. And you can have your colleagues step up for you. But so holding people accountable to in Lakesh and yourself first is one way. Another way is to have them articulate the world that they want, you know, because if the world they want doesn't have some like moral center, then what are we doing here? Then that's probably going to be a waste of time. And so so we have to be mindful of not of hit, you know, I believe in hitting the rock until it breaks. I believe in people and the ability to change, but I also understand that if you're really centered on exploiting people and you're good with that and you can articulate that maybe I should spend time with people that are interested in and conflicted about where they're at, those conservative folks. And the last thing I would say is when it comes to talking with those folks is to use the current times. How's this working out for us? You know, how has this system been, you know, why wouldn't we want to try something radically different? Because unless you're pro-death, unless you're pro-vitriol and the vile rhetoric that we hear and dehumanizing rhetoric, if we want that to be the space that catches our 4-year-olds every day through 20-year-olds, then then I'm gonna have to move you over to that side where you don't have that any moral center where we can connect. But for the most part, I think people know that things are wrong. The thing is, a lot of European American folks, conservative folks too, because they're not always just white folk. We're just scared. We're just scared. And so what we have to do is disarm people's fear. And that can only be done in relation and in conversation and not giving up on folks unless they flat out want to hurt you.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the great questions. We'll talk about how to maybe get some of the slides to you that if you weren't able to read them because they were blurry. Would you mind any contact information you want people to have to be able, maybe to your website, and just type that into the chat box for people?
Sure.
Anybody who might want that. So at least you'll have that and can reach out via email if you want to maybe connect with one of the upcoming professional development opportunities that Dr. Acosta's organizations are going to be sponsoring. So at least you'll have that. And I will also send that when I send out the link to this session. So thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I'm glad, after years of, admiring you and your work and your activism and your teaching, that we finally had an opportunity to connect in front of, like 500 people, but still it's great. And, I look forward to a time when we can, connect in person sometime and just hear more about each other's journeys.
Absolutely. I look forward to that day, Paul. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll PDF all this for everyone and send you a flyer with the other information if that's helpful. And you can send it out with the link.
Okay, that's perfect. That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
This was really great.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate it.